In the 1930s, a dancing plague was sweeping America. The Great Depression had descended onto the country, and suddenly millions of Americans were struck by poverty and hunger. It was a matter of life and death for some families. But then, a saviour came in the form of dancing competitions with huge cash prizes. But these weren't just any old dancing competitions, they were endurance dancing marathons. There was no end to them. They lasted for days, even weeks and months, with every contestant trying to be the last one standing, or the last one dancing. Whoever could dance the longest would win the money. But with everyone being so desperate to provide for their families during the Great Depression, things became savage and dystopian. Contestants grew weak and sleep deprived, with many people falling into psychosis, even injuring themselves or dying out on the dance floor. So thank God it's Freaky Friday. Today we're going to be talking about the deadly depression dance-a-thons. Before we get into this episode, I just want to thank our sponsor for making this video possible, Magellan TV. I've talked about Magellan 1,000,001 times on this channel, and fun fact, the original Mr. Magellan, Ferdinand Magellan, was the first person to sail all the way around the whole entire world. And with Magellan TV, you can also watch stories from pretty much anywhere around the world too. I recently watched their new documentary, All for Nothing, The Life and Death of Bruno Braun. Bruno was an icon in the gay community of Cape Town. He ran one of the most poppin' bars in town before his long-term relationship ended in tragedy. After entering a new relationship and admitting anxiety about his new partner, Bruno was later found strangled. Magellan TV is the perfect place to find your true crime fix after you've finished watching this video, obviously. I'm obsessed with their true crime section. I rinse it like every single weekend, especially on Sundays. When I have my lazy Sundays, it's just me and Magellan. They add between 15 and 20 hours of new content every single week, so there's always something new for you to sink your teeth into. They have a huge selection of different documentaries. It's not just true crime, although that part is my favourite, but they do have loads of different genres, from history to space to science, travel, and so much more. And as always, there's a special offer waiting for you guys when you click the link down below in the description of this video, where you can watch the documentary I spoke about before about Bruno Braun, or any of the other amazing documentaries Magellan has to offer. I love them so much. You all know that, and I know that you would love them too if you love my channel, so make sure you're checking out Magellan TV. And thanks again to them for sponsoring another video on my channel. Love you guys. Before we get into today's episode, I just want to warn you that we're going to be covering a lot of sensitive topics today, including attempted suicide, psychosis, and physical abuse. As always with my videos, viewer discretion is advised. And while we make every effort to fact check our sources and make sure that all of our information is correct, no action should be taken in reliance upon the information in this video. All opinions about to be stated in this video are mine, and mine alone. And with that being said, let's get into the deadly dances. In 1923, life in America was just one big party. When I think of the 20s, I think of The Great Gatsby. Of course, it was the roaring 20s. It was all sparkles and glitz and glam on the surface, but with something rotten lurking underneath. It was a time when gin was the national drink and sex was the national obsession. But throughout the 20s and even into the 30s, there was a nationwide prohibition in America that meant that it was illegal to buy and sell and therefore consume alcohol. But people weren't about to let the law get in the way of their good time, of course not. So this was when speakeasies started to pop up in pretty much every city in America, and these were an illegal solution to prohibition. Speakeasies were little underground venues, sometimes even literally underground. I did actually mean that in more of a metaphorical sense, that they were like secretive and hidden, but yeah, sometimes they would be like basements or even like small rooms above other businesses, like restaurants or whatever. But the idea was that they were secret and you didn't know that a speakeasy was there just from the street. The point is that they were hidden. They were secret places where people could gather to buy and drink alcohol together. There are a lot of speakeasies that are kind of still in business. Obviously now they're not illegal, they are just small secretive bars. Those are all the hidden spots that people spread like through word of mouth. I went to one when I was in New York. Vlog coming soon on the second channel. It was so cool. I love the vibe of a speakeasy. It's all like dim lighting. It still feels like it's supposed to be quite secretive, but obviously, alcohol has been legal to drink for the past 100 years. Oh, well, nearly 100 years. We're nearly 100 years out of Prohibition, woo. But basically, the point I'm trying to make is that even though they had Prohibition and there was a lot against them in the 20s, they were still finding a way to have a right old good time. The Roaring 20s was a riot. The economy was booming. People were, on the whole, having fun. But then, two very specific crazes from the time ended up fusing together and becoming deadly. The first was jazz music and just dancing in general. This was the time when the Charleston was first brought about, everyone was doing it, everyone loved a little dance. And the other was endurance sports. The Olympic Games had finally been brought back after like an 8-year hiatus through World War I, and so everyone was obsessed with physical sport again, even like endurance sport. So this obsession with the Olympics led to a lot of amateur competitions, physical competitions popping up everywhere, including endurance dancing competitions. Who could dance for the longest? A world record was actually set in 1923 when a dance instructor named Alma Cummings waltzed for 27 hours straight. That's insane. That was in the first ever recorded endurance dance marathon. There might have been some before that, but this was the first recorded one and the first like recorded world record of someone dancing non-stop for over a fucking whole day. That's crazy. Of course, Alma won the competition, and by the end of it, her feet were a mess. She had completely worn holes in the soles of her shoes. She genuinely couldn't dance any longer, even if she wanted to. To be fair, her shoes falling apart was probably one of the biggest reasons that she had to stop. I feel like Alma probably had a bit more in her. Not only had she broken her shoes, but she had also broken 6 male dance partners throughout that dance marathon. She had started off with one and he just couldn't keep up with her, and so a second was brought in, then a third, fourth, fifth, sixth. They just couldn't keep up with the dancing queen herself. All of those 6 men that had tried to dance alongside Alma had been other people competing in this competition. Like, they did want to be there, but they just couldn't keep up with her. They were getting exhausted. They would be disqualified if they stopped dancing. A lot of them were just getting tired. They just didn't have the stamina that Alma had. Alma Cummings had done what literally nobody had ever done before. I mean, is that not the whole point of a world record, I guess? She had started a legacy. A craze that would span over 2 decades. Unfortunately for Alma, her record was soon broken. I mean, what a double-edged sword it must be to become so famous for your craft that you bring a load of attention to it, other people start trying it out, and then they beat you at the thing that you were best at, the thing you had a world record in. But Alma was the start of something huge, something that would have both positive outcomes and absolutely harrowing consequences. After this, dance marathons swept the nation. Anyone was welcome to enter these dancing competitions. All you needed was a dance partner and you were in. Couples would come along to their local dance-a-thon, and when I say couples, I don't necessarily mean romantic couples. People would enter these competitions as platonic couples, brothers and sisters, friends, you know. But they would go along to these dance-a-thons and they would be going for hours. And in the beginning, it was all just good fun. It was just like a competitive sport. People started off doing it purely just for the love of dancing and to go out and have a good night with your friend or your partner. A lot of dedicated dancers would apply for these dance-a-thons kind of hoping to break Alma's record or whoever had beaten her record in the meantime. There were a lot of, you know, promising young dancers that really took advantage of this craze, but things quickly began to spiral out of control and take a very disturbing turn when the idea of a grand prize was introduced for the winners. Suddenly, dancers and, well, normal people had a new devastating motive to enter these dance-a-thons and to push their bodies to their physical limits. Everyone needed money, and now these dance-a-thons were a way to make money. And this was made even worse when the stock market crashed on October 29th, 1929, a day that has come to be known as Black Tuesday, the stock market crashed, and with that began the Great Depression. That day was the kickoff of a bleak economic depression across pretty much the whole entire world. Almost every single country was affected by this. The Great Depression ruined and even ended a lot of lives, mainly a lot of American lives, but again, like I say, it affected the whole world. Around 25% of Americans, a quarter of them, were suddenly out of work. And that was about 12 million people, by the way. That's more than the current population of Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland all in one. Or if you're from America, that is more than the population of Ohio. Everyone was suddenly out of work, and because the whole country was in this economic depression, businesses couldn't afford to hire people. There were no jobs going. Everyone was looking for jobs, but there weren't any to go around. Survival was suddenly very difficult for the average family, and money was quite literally a matter of life or death. So many people struggled to pay their bills, to put food on the table, to care for and clothe and feed their growing children. Families that struggled to make rent or struggled to pay their mortgage payments risked losing their house completely, risked being kicked out and becoming homeless. But everyone felt so hopeless because, like I said, nowhere was hiring. People were in these dire financial situations but couldn't see any solution or any way out. And it was so dire, in fact, that many Americans became suicidal throughout the Great Depression. There were a hell of a lot of lives lost to suicide. People that just couldn't see a future. People that struggled to care for their families and provide for their families. They became so depressed that they didn't want to live anymore. Suicide rates in America actually increased by 22% in the 1930s, which is such a heartbreaking statistic, that people felt like they had no other option because they felt like they just couldn't afford to survive in this world. It's so incredibly sad to think how many people lost everything, how many people became homeless. In fact, people started to build their own shanty towns on the outskirts of big cities. They would make their own new homes out of cardboard and wood because they couldn't afford rent. They had no other choice than to literally build their own shelter out of materials that they could find in the street. And all of these shanty towns all across America were given the same name, Hooverville. They were named after the US president at the time, Herbert Hoover, who was very much blamed for a lot of the Great Depression. And I think naming these ramshackled homeless communities after the president that put them in that situation was the only way that these people could really make their voices heard. It's almost like calling attention to what he has done to his citizens. We're all in this homeless community named after you. Are you proud of what you've done to this country? I mean, I personally don't know all that much about Herbert Hoover. If anyone has anything to add to that, please do put in the comments. I'm not very well versed on my very vintage American history. But just to summarize all of that, clearly the 1930s were a huge juxtaposition to the immense fun that everyone had been having in the 20s just a few years before. But that was all behind them now. They had been plunged into an incredibly bleak time, and those same dance competitions that people were doing for a bit of fun in the 1920s had started becoming a serious option for a lot of people looking to make ends meet, a lot of people looking to provide for their families. They saw these dance competitions and the cash prizes and saw it as a genuine way to save themselves from the Great Depression. Of course, there was a super low barrier for entry to these endurance dance competitions. Anyone was welcome to enter, even the unskilled, the uneducated, the inexperienced. It didn't matter. If you just keep moving your feet, then you're in. So for a lot of Americans, especially those without very employable skills, they saw these endurance dance marathons as one of their only options to be able to support their families. They were practically forced to become a performing monkey just to make ends meet. It's so dystopian. The days of dancing for fun were over. people were now dancing for survival. So, the aim of the game of these endurance dance marathons was to keep dancing the longest. Literally, outdance all of your competition until everyone around you gets so exhausted or bows out or gets disqualified. You have to be the last man standing to be able to win that grand cash prize. Not just the last man standing, the last man dancing. Like, this is an active, exhausting thing that people were putting themselves through for days, weeks, months at a time. Dancers' feet had to constantly be moving, otherwise they would be disqualified. And like I mentioned earlier, you couldn't actually sign up for these competitions as a solo dancer. You did have to be part of a couple, although I believe you could sign up as a solo dancer looking to be paired up with another solo dancer, you know? But as with the case of Alma Cummings, dancers didn't often end the competition with the same partner that they'd started it with. If a dancer's partner was disqualified or exhausted or bowed out, then the remaining one was allowed to dance by themselves until another couple got broken up by another disqualification or whatever, and then they would pair those two remaining solo dancers together to create a new couple. But not all was very fair in these dance competitions. Sometimes, depending on the game host, they would just kick out a solo dancer. If it was taking too long for another person to come free to make a couple with them, then they would just kick the solo dancer out, even if they had no reason to be like disqualified or anything. Just a bit unfair, that. But the hosts of these events didn't really care about fair. They didn't really care about their dancers' feelings or their well-being or even their safety a lot of the time. All the hosts cared about was putting on a great show for the audience. That's right, there was an audience for all of this, but we'll get back to that in a second. Let's actually talk about the competition hosts first, because there would often be multiple different hosts, because remember, these competitions were going round the clock 24/7, so the hosts would work in shifts. They would kind of like wander the dance floor and make sure all the dancers were still dancing and moving their feet, and if they weren't, then the host was the one to disqualify them. Contestants weren't actually allowed to leave the building throughout the competition. As long as they wanted to be included in the competition, they weren't even allowed to step out for fresh air. Well, actually, this is one thing that I kind of realized in my research, that each dance-a-thon seem to have different rules. I guess it depends on what kind of person your host was. If they were a nice person, then yeah, you might be allowed outside. They would give them like supervised fresh air breaks. Like a member of staff would have to be out there watching them at all times. I don't know what they thought they were gonna do. But yeah, there were some dance-a-thons where no, you weren't even allowed to step outside for fresh air, not even with a supervisor. Supervisor? Dance-a-thon supervisor? Was that a thing? I don't know. A member of staff. But this whole not being allowed outside thing gets really concerning because, well, remember at first when dance-a-thons were first invented, they would only run for about a day. Remember, Alma Cummings won the world record for 27 hours. That's just over a whole day, which is still a long-ass time for a dance-a-thon. But once the Great Depression hit and people were so desperate for those grand prizes, that's when they started pushing themselves longer and longer. It became days and then weeks and then months. Some people were literally being locked in those fucking dance halls, not being able to go out for fresh air for months at a time. They wouldn't see their friends and family. Unless their friends and family came to visit them in the audience or whatever, then people weren't seeing their newborn children, their husbands, their wives, their kids, their families for months. Oh my God, I just realized that like people's parents would be dying as well. Like imagine, oh my God, no, I don't want to imagine. But I think that really frames how desperate this was, that people knew that their parents were dying and they wouldn't be able to see them for a couple of months if they took part in the dance-a-thon, but they needed that money so bad that they would. People would leave their newborn children at home to go and take part in these dance-a-thons. As time went on, the dance-a-thons started to include mini breaks. Now, I don't think these mini breaks were a thing when Alma Cummings did her first like world record. But of course, as the dance-a-thons started lasting days, weeks, months, they were like, shit, like we really need to be looking after these people maybe, give them regular breaks. So dancers were allowed 15 minutes off for every hour that that they danced. Well, no, I think it was 15 minutes off and then 45 minutes on. Just every hour, they got a 15-minute break. But like I said, that break time had to be within the building. They weren't allowed to leave the building. They weren't allowed to do anything. They would have to stay on the premises, but they were allowed to do anything that they felt they needed to do, you know, like go to the bathroom or do a bit of like personal grooming, brush their teeth, brush their hair. Men would shave during this 15 minutes, sorry guys. But of course, after a full day's dancing, when you get a 15-minute break, you're not going to want to spend it like brushing your hair or shaving your face. You're going to want to sit down and give your feet a rest, aren't you? People would even try to have short naps in these 15 minutes. Because imagine, they're all going to be sleep deprived. If they have to constantly dance around the clock with only 15-minute breaks, yeah, a lot of the time they were using them to sleep. And at the end of that 15 minutes, they would be awoken by this really freaking loud air horn signaling that the break was over, and they would have to get their ass up out of the cot bed, and they would have to shuffle back onto the dance floor and dance for another 45 minutes. Oh, I forgot to explain the kind of break situation. So the dance-a-thons would have two separate break rooms that were separated by sex, for men, for women. They would go in and there were like rows and rows of cot beds that they could nap on or rest on or whatever. More often than not, the air horns would work to wake up the dancers from their naps, but on the odd occasion that they didn't wake up, sometimes they were so sleep deprived that like they just couldn't wake up. On those occasions, the hosts of the event would help them to wake up. But on those occasions where the host would have to do something, for the men, they would pour a big bucket of ice water over them to like shock them awake. But for the women, they would slap them around the face, which made me fuming to read about. They would put their hands on the women, but not on the men. Of course, misogyny still exists. Even in this fucked up little dancing world, they are still cruel to the women. And I mean, dance-a-thon judges and hosts, I'm gonna be using like judge and host interchangeably because there were a few people that were like in charge and working these events, but they were all quite cruel. They knew that they could get away with a lot. They could get away with borderline abusing the contestants because they knew how desperate the contestants were to stay in the competition. They weren't going to complain, they weren't going to kick off because they didn't want to risk getting disqualified. They would take as much abuse and humiliation as they had to be able to stay in the competition on the off chance of winning the prize to provide for their family. It is so sad. And even in the cases where people would be splashed or slapped awake from their naps, if they did wake up but just took too long to get back to the dance floor, they would even still be disqualified. It was, like I say, it was quite unfair sometimes. Of course, as the days and the weeks were going by in these competitions, contestants would prioritize napping in those 15 minutes because they were very, very sleep deprived. But of course, if they used that whole 15 minutes for sleep every single time, then they wouldn't have any time to see to their other needs. And this actually led to a lot of pissing on the dance floor. Sophie Ellis-Bextor's new hit single, Pissing on the Dance Floor, and then Barry Keoghan just joins the dance-a-thon butt naked. No, but seriously, when the 15 minutes was used for sleeping, that meant that every other task had to be carried out on the dance floor while they were dancing. Often, men would be shaving their faces while still trying to shuffle around. There were these specific like contraptions that were made for the women to wear. They would put it over their head and it'd be like a mirror for their partner to be able to look in and like shave as they were bopping about. Or if contestants needed to write letters, because remember, the world doesn't just stop just because you've decided to enter a dance-a-thon. There still were business matters to attend to. They wanted to write to their family. So again, there was this kind of desk contraption that would go around the person's own neck this time. It was just like a hovering desk that you could write your letters on, again, while still boogieing. Dancers would often be seen shuffling along, reading the latest newspaper, or doing some knitting a scarf or a jumper for their grandkids. There were just a lot of little, like, daily tasks going on the dance floor while they were just like stepping their feet about because they had to. It actually wasn't very uncommon for dancers to be so sleep deprived, in fact, that they would just pass out on their partner and just like go unconscious and floppy. And their partner would then take it upon themselves to keep the two of them in the competition by like shuffling around their unconscious partner, making sure that their feet never stop moving. And this would actually keep them in the competition. The judges didn't care if they were moving their own feet, just as long as their feet were moving, which is awful. There are actually so many pictures on Google that I came across of like one dancer just holding up their partner while they took a standing nap. But again, because they were so sleep deprived, sometimes they wouldn't be able to wake up from these naps. And I actually read a case study about a guy named Joseph, right? And he would take these standing naps on his partners. He entered a lot of dance-a-thons. I think he just enjoyed them. But he would let his partner know before they started dancing. He would be like, look, when I take these standing naps, sometimes I really struggle to wake up. So just feel free to punch me in the jaw to wake me up. What? But you know what? One of his partners once did it. She like started punching him in the jaw. He weren't waking up. She like started kicking him in the shins and everything. He just wasn't waking up. I think he did eventually, but crazy. It does just keep getting more and more dystopian as we're going on, don't you think? Like, hosts didn't care that there were unconscious bodies being dragged around the dance floor. Just as long as their knees weren't touching the floor and their feet kept going, the competition goes on. I think it's just disgusting. I think it's just so harrowing. Like, imagine being in the audience. I wouldn't want to see that. I wouldn't find that entertaining or fun, watching people suffer like that. Often, to encourage these lagging couples that might be dancing a bit too slow or not moving their feet enough, hosts would take a ruler stick and smack them on the shins with it. Like I've said a few times, the rules of each dance-a-thon seem to be very different. So a lot of these little things that the hosts would do were sometimes quite specific to different venues. There was one particular venue that didn't allow partners to kind of drift away from each other. They had to be dancing up close the whole time. So in that place, couples even took to chaining themselves together with dog chain to make sure that they wouldn't drift too far apart and then get disqualified. And remember, all of this started out as just a fun little dance competition, a fun way for people to show up and show off their skill and their stamina. But now people are literally chaining themselves together, pissing themselves on the dance floor, being dragged around while they're unconscious. This was not what endurance dance marathons were supposed to be. People were so terrified of being eliminated from the dance-a-thons, because remember what is on the line. It was money to feed the kids, money to keep the family home. But the cash prize at the end wasn't the only benefit that desperate people would get out of the dance-a-thons, because one thing I forgot to mention earlier is that all of their food and water would be provided for them as long as they were in the competition. So that's just another reason for people to sign up to these. It meant that they wouldn't have to pay for groceries for the whole week. If they could last a week, then that would save money on their expenses. People that were so deep in poverty that they didn't know when or where their next meal was going to come from would sign up to the dance-a-thons to make sure that they were fed. Sometimes people knew that there was no chance they were going to get the grand prize. They just didn't have the stamina, they just couldn't really be bothered, or they didn't have the time to commit to a dance-a-thon like that, but they would still go for a week or so, you know, to make sure that they were fed. There were so many reasons why being eliminated was people's worst nightmare. It meant no more free food, it meant no more chance of the grand prize. For a lot of them, it was a place to sleep as well. I mean, I know you don't get a full night's sleep, but at least there is a dry, clean bed in a warm, sheltered room for you to sleep in for 15 minutes. Which is so sad that people would enter these competitions for just the tiniest scraps of comfort. When contestants would be eliminated from the dance-a-thons, they would break down in tears. They would beg the judges literally on their knees to stay in the competition. It was so important to them. But especially given all of the physical and psychological damage that contestants were taking from these competitions, the cash prizes were actually tiny. Sometimes they wouldn't win any more than $500. Sometimes it was on the side of $1,000, but $500 was quite the average dance-a-thon prize cash pot. That was the level of desperation that these contestants were at. They were willingly undergoing all types of pain, exhaustion, humiliation for months at a time, all for $500. Of course, $500 in the 1930s would have been worth a lot more than $500 today. The equivalent would have been about $8,000, which is a lot more. That is a much better prize, but it's still not like insanely life-changing money. That would probably make sure that their bills and their rent were covered for a good few months and they could put food on the table for a while, but I mean, I don't know, it's not going to buy you a huge new house and like set you all for life, is it? But people were so desperate. And remember how slim the chances of them winning were. There were hundreds of people in each competition, but only one person or one couple was going to go away with the prize pot. But lucky for the contestants, the grand prize wasn't the only way that they could make money through these competitions. And this is where the audience comes in. First off, I want you to imagine the kind of people that are gonna be in an audience for an event like this, happily watching people suffer, desperate people struggling to keep dancing, passing out on each other. Of course, the audience was full of rich people that didn't need to worry about partaking in such desperate events like that for money. It was all the people that could provide for themselves, all the people that were struggling less. I mean, the Great Depression hit everyone. I'm sure it did. But there were people that were getting by fine. And those were the kind of people that would go down and watch all of this desperation, all of these people competing and almost dying for $500. The hosts and the judges of these dance-a-thons were always kind of on the side of the audience because those were the paying customers, those were the people paying for tickets. The dance-a-thon people didn't pay to be there. In fact, the dance-a-thon contestants cost them money. They had to feed them. So the hosts were always on the audience's side, doing everything that they could to make it a more interesting and entertaining show for the audience to watch. And again, as I've been saying, each dance-a-thon was very different, but the hosts would start to almost abuse the contestants in different ways. I mentioned about like smacking a ruler on their shins to keep them dancing, but just wait until you hear about the mini game type things that they would do. They weren't called mini games at the time. That's just my like rotted Gen Z brain coming up with a term for it. I've played too many video games in my time, but they would essentially break away from the main competition, the main dance-a-thon, to do mini competitions with the contestants. They were like mini games. And there were two main purposes for these mini games. One, to keep it interesting for the audience because I don't know, especially towards the end of the dance-a-thons when all the people were tired and they weren't putting much effort into it anymore. It wasn't a very fun show to watch. So the hosts would put in these mini games to spice it up and keep it interesting. And the second reason these mini games would happen is to eliminate more people, to speed up the competition. Most of these mini game type things were different forms of races. Some of them would be quite low stakes. Sometimes the host would go, right, 25 laps around the dance hall, and all the contestants would just have to run 25 laps around the dance hall. No one would get eliminated from those kind of things. It was quite low stakes. I'm guessing those ones were just to kind of like tire out the dancers a bit more. But then there were elimination races that were a lot higher stakes, and they would make contestants race from one end of the hall to the other against the other couples, and whoever lost would be disqualified from the whole competition. So in the end, it wasn't even all about dancing. You could be the best dancer in the room, but if you're not a very fast runner, you're out. They had all kinds of variations on these elimination races. Sometimes contestants would be blindfolded, so you just got to try and run to the end of the room and back again without like falling over, I don't know. And sometimes they would chain partners together, almost like a three-legged race, but it was a lot more than that. They were like dog chained up together, full body and everything, and they would make them run against each other. Imagine having danced for weeks, practically non-stop, and then all of a sudden they call an elimination race, and then you have to run blindfolded and chained to your partner just to stay in the competition. I'd kick off. I'd be like, yo, this is not what I signed up for. I signed up for a dance competition. Get these chains off of me. It's actually a bit barbaric, putting these people through so much just for the audience's entertainment. It feels like the Hunger Games. It feels like Squid Game, you know, when they've all got those masks on behind the screens and they're just watching them all suffer. Oh my god, I can't wait for Squid Game season 2. Sorry. That got me really excited about Squid Game. But seriously, hearing an elimination race being called would send shivers down the spine of all of the contestants because they knew that one of them was not proceeding beyond the competition. If contestants were too tired or too slow, they would lose everything, and elimination races often ended in floods of tears. It was total carnage on the dance floor. These dance-a-thons are not anywhere near as cute as they sound. People's feet were bleeding, people's bodies were literally giving up under the immense pressure that they were putting themselves under. People actually used to call dance-a-thons bunion derbies back in the day because of how much they used to damage people's feet. Even in the elimination races, people were still passing out, they were getting severely injured, people had broken bones. But just like the dancing couldn't stop, neither could the races. Competitors had no choice. If they didn't want to join in the race, they would just be disqualified. They just had to do it. And sometimes when people's partners would pass out during the races, they would still try to fucking haul them across the finish line. There were even cases where unconscious bodies would rattle across the finish line. But of course, it was all in the name of entertaining the audience, hey? And this is why I think the whole thing is so degrading. People didn't have a choice but to be in these competitions to try to make money to provide for their families, but now they're being poked and prodded and laughed at and put in these awful situations. It was like watching any other sport. For the people in the audience, they were enjoying the show. And that contrast between how the rich are feeling about this versus how the poor are feeling about this makes me, I don't know, it just makes this whole thing so icky feeling. The tickets that the audience would buy to go and watch the dance-a-thons were 25 cents at the time, which is about $5, so not that expensive. And there was no time limit on them either, so you could buy a ticket in the morning and be in there all day and all night if you wanted to. But not everyone in the audience was necessarily rich with money to burn. Because the tickets were relatively cheap, a lot of poor people that could afford the tickets would go to watch the even poorer people suffer, and it would give them some sort of sense of superiority. Like, yes, I'm still financially struggling, but at least I'm not that bad. Even if those poorer people had to save up for a ticket to go and watch a dance-a-thon, they would still do it, just to remind themselves that at least they're not the one on the dance floor. But regardless of financial status, every single person in the audience of a dance-a-thon was guilty of the same thing, sharing a perverse delight in witnessing the physical suffering going on in front of them. And there's actually a name for this phenomena. Schadenfreude is when you experience joy or satisfaction from witnessing the failure, pain, or humiliation of others. And the dance-a-thon hosts knew what the audience was there for. They knew what the audience wanted to see, more and more suffering. And so the hosts would facilitate that. They would keep upping the ante for the dancers. At some dance-a-thon venues, they would do cot nights, which is where they would bring all the cots out of the separate break rooms and they would put them on the dance floor so that even during their breaks, the audience was still constantly watching the dancers. Even in their very brief moments of privacy and rest, well, they didn't have any privacy anymore. That was the whole point. It's getting very big brothery at this point, you know, like they are just wanting to watch these people just for the sake of watching them and feeling superior to them. Dance marathons were like the ultimate human spectacle. And naturally, the evenings were the most intense time of day for the dance-a-thons because that's when all the rich people had finished work and they were all, you know, buying a ticket to the dance-a-thon for the evening. And when the crowds were at full capacity, the hosts knew that they had to pull out all the stops to make it a good show. So this is when the bulk of those like elimination races and stuff like that would happen. Contestants also had to put a lot more effort into their actual dancing during the later hours. They would get smacked on the shin even more during these hours because, again, it was all part of the performance. People don't pay to come and see people like you know, flopping around. They want to see energy. They want to see smiles. They want to see performance, not a bunch of people looking tired and sad. So the hosts would run around making sure that all their dancers were looking good. The hosts might let off like tired, weak shuffling across the dance floor during the day, but absolutely not. When all the rich people were there after work, the dancers were gonna dance. And when it came to entertaining the crowd, nothing was off limits. As I said earlier, there were a few different ways that competitors would make a little bit of extra money that wasn't the grand prize. And this is where the idea of sponsorship comes in. Couples could actually be sponsored by small businesses in the local area to be like a walking, dancing advert for them. Businesses and service providers would pay the contestants to put their logo on their shirt for the whole time that they were competing in the dance-a-thon. So yeah, they would be like a dancing little billboard for these different businesses. It's kind of like football shirts now. I've always found it really funny when they have like all those different logos like across their shirts, like they're collecting Boy Scout badges. It's really cute. But the idea is that the brands would get recognition, they would get publicity, being plastered in front of the audience's eyes for weeks, hopefully months at a time, would be great for business. And it was also great for the contestants, because even if they didn't make it to the end of the competition, even if they didn't win the grand prize, they would still get a fee from being sponsored by this business. They were getting paid just for wearing a specific shirt for a couple of weeks. But being sponsored was a double-edged sword. Of course, it meant that you would get a guaranteed little bit of money at the end of the competition, but being sponsored meant that you had to dance well and look good doing it at all times, because now you were representative of that brand, and the brand owner would not be happy if you were one of the worst dancers on the floor. Now, I don't know much about brand psychology myself, but it has been proven that consumers will make subconscious links and associations with a brand and certain, I don't know, traits and things that it associates itself with. So for example, say I'm joining a dance-a-thon and I get sponsored by Tesco. I've got big Tesco logo on my chest, and then I start getting weak and exhausted, and I'm maybe not a very good dancer in the first place. I've got 2 left feet. People might start to look at me in my big Tesco shirt and think, damn, that Tesco dancer's a bit shit. And then they're just going to associate Tesco with inferiority, being a bit shit. And even worse, imagine if my sponsor brand's biggest competitor was also sponsoring another dancer that was 10 times better than me. That's going to make the brand's competitor look 10 times better than the brand on my shirt. And once people have made these subconscious associations, they can be very long-lasting and hard to break. So one bad sponsored dancer could almost ruin a brand's image. It was very important that they only picked the best dancers, and that those dancers kept dancing. And of course, every single person that entered these competitions that planned on being in there in a while, they all wanted to get sponsored because it was guaranteed money in their pocket at the end, even if they didn't get the prize. So before dancers were even offered a sponsor, the pressure was on to attract sponsorships. They would have to go into a dance-a-thon and show up and show out, show that they were the best dancer on the floor and that they were worthy of being sponsored. There was just so much that goes into the dystopianness. Well, that's definitely not a word. What's the word? The actual word I was looking for was dystopianism. But especially when you remember how it all started, with just people that enjoyed dancing, with dance instructors all competing against each other, and Alma Cummings getting a world record of 27 hours. That sounds like a lot, but it sounds healthier. In fact, a lot healthier. And then the dystopianism comes in, hey, my new word. And suddenly all the fun is drained out of these dance competitions, and it is replaced with just a whole lot of mental stress, physical injury. It just sounds like an absolute nightmare. Something that was supposed to be so fun and lighthearted and bring people together was starting to kill people. But circling back to sponsorships, because they actually weren't the only way that contestants could make a little bit of extra money. Contestants had a couple of different options when it came to a side hustle during a dance-a-thon, which again, the dystopianism of it all. The fact that just entering this competition wasn't even enough, they then had to have multiple side hustles whilst they were constantly moving their feet and only ever having 15-minute naps. There were a lot of contestants that would try to earn a little bit of extra money by entertaining the audience members one-on-one. They would put on a little show. People that could sing would sing a song. People would even do like little comedy routines and gags and all that kind of stuff. And the audience would like throw pennies at them as if it was like a tip for a street performer. And again, what a horrifying image. These people are so desperate for like 5 cents, 10 cents from the audience that they're scrambling to pick up the coins off the floor before any of the other dancers steal them. I don't know. for like 10 cents. But again, it was a good deal for the dancers. They didn't have to worry about trying to achieve the huge jackpot. If they could make enough tips from the audience, then they'd be all right. And this kind of thing was heavily encouraged by the dance-a-thon hosts. Anything that could make this experience more entertaining and interesting for the audience was a win. Hosts would call out to the audience and encourage them to make it rain with a silver shower, aka throw all of your pennies at the dirty little dancers. Honestly, I think this is the worst part of all of this for me. I mean, there's a lot of parts to choose from, isn't there? This whole thing is just devastating. But the idea of these people performing and scrambling to pick up 10 cents at a time, having it thrown at them like they're an animal, I don't know, that image makes me really upset. But despite all of this desperation and suffering and poverty, at the end of the day, there were still a lot of people that would take part in the dance-a-thons just for a fun time. Not everyone was there desperately trying to get the grand prize or trying to provide for their families. It was just still a fun activity, and people were just still really into dancing in the 20s and 30s. Most of the people that entered endurance dance marathons didn't push it to a dangerous limit. A lot of people that would take part were actually budding performers. People that wanted to be actors or dancers or singers would go down to the dance-a-thons and perform for these audiences, hoping that it might be their big break. But their big break was hardly waiting for them in the audience of a dance-a-thon. I mean, this never really happened. No one ever really got picked up from a dance-a-thon and made a star. Because think about who is in the audience. If there were some big movie or music execs in the audience, they weren't there looking for talent. They were there to laugh at the poor people that are dancing for 10 cents. And actually, contestants would be super lucky if their birthday fell on a dance-a-thon day. Sometimes they would make it up. Sometimes they would lie and say, today is my birthday. So then the audience would throw like little birthday gifts. I say gifts, it was like 10 cents again. They would just throw them pennies. But again, like, if it was your birthday, or if it was wink wink your birthday, and it actually wasn't, then what a good way to secure a little bit of cash anyway. And I think this actually really kicked something off. People realized that they could get tips for nice celebrations, I guess. So people started to really push the limits of that. There was a sudden wave of men proposing to their sweetheart on the dance floor in the middle of an endurance dance marathon so that the whole room would erupt in applause and they would be showered with tips and good wishes and, you know. And that would go even further because sometimes those couples would then get married, have their wedding ceremony on the dance floor whilst always dancing, remember? I'm trying to imagine guys trying to propose, like getting down on one knee but still like moving your knee. I don't know. It's literally so crazy how much weird shit came out of the dance marathons. I can't believe it. But I do just keep coming back to all of that mental and physical stress that they were under. Like, imagine trying to enjoy your wedding or your proposal, but you haven't slept or stopped moving in weeks. Now, we've talked about Alma Cummings a lot in this video, the first ever record holder at a dance marathon, but I'm sure you're wondering who the reigning champion is. There was one couple that danced for the longest out of every single other couple in the whole of America. They danced from December all the way through until June the next year. That is 6 months. I did the math. That's 3,780 hours. That is insane. The reigning champions were a platonic couple from Massachusetts called Callum and Vonnie. They were so powerful, in fact, I mean, it got to 6 months, and the hosts and everyone else at that dance-a-thon were starting to think, well, realistically, when are they gonna give up? And they were trying everything to make it harder for Callum and Vonnie because they were the longest running dancers by a mile as well. And they just seemed like they could keep going and going and going. So first, their 15-minute breaks were cut down to just 3 minutes per hour. And that was only in the last 2 weeks of the contest. I'm honestly surprised it took so long for such a drastic measure to be taken because they were dancing for 6 months before that. Well, 5.5 months. I can't believe it took 5.5 months for them to be like, right, we've got to do something. We've got to stop these people. I just know the host of that game was getting so bored. Like, just imagine being like, guys, pack it in. Yous are the only ones left. Like, I want to go home. Well, no, there would have been another couple that they were against, wouldn't there, actually? Because it would have been the top 2. Wow, okay. Realizing that has actually changed everything. There's 4 people dancing for 6 months. So their 15-minute breaks were cut down to 3-minute breaks, and somehow they were managing with that for 2 more weeks. And it got to the point where the host was like, what more can we do? Fine, no breaks at all. You've just got to constantly dance now for the rest of the competition. You're gonna have to sleep at some point. So for the final 52 hours of the competition, that's over 2 whole days, Callum and Vonnie kept dancing non-stop. No toilet breaks, no naps, no rests, nothing. Wait, where were they peeing? Where were they peeing? Maybe they were one of the Sophie Ellis-Bextor pissing on the dance floor people. Anyway, on June 3rd, 1933, the couple finally won the dance-a-thon, and they took home the $1,000 grand prize, which is about £18,000 now. But they had the world record, hey! I find that so mad. Like, I can fully acknowledge that £18,000 is a lot of money, and for a lot of people it would do a lot for their lives. But imagine dancing for 6 months non-stop, and then at the end of it, you only get 18,000. I'd be like, where are the Euro Millions jackpot? I need £2 million for this. But the part of this story that gets me the most is actually the part that I only just clocked just then, is that there was another couple that was competing against them up until that very last minute. There was another couple that had danced for 6 months non-stop and just missed out on $1,000. I just think it's so harrowing that another couple also put themselves through all of that and then didn't see a reward. Or maybe they did. I really, really hope that the host of that game went easy on the other couple and gave them something. But overall, of course, Callum and Vonnie's story is a happy one, but one of the very few happy ones that we have to talk about. Of course, there were a lot of dire consequences of these endurance dance-a-thons. A lot of horror stories came out of it, and I'll be honest, that was the part that I was the most eager to dig into when I first started working on this. It just really fascinated me that this like fun, happy little thing that we do, you know, dancing, it's supposed to be nice and bring people together, and we do it every weekend at the club, hey. I don't know, it's supposed to be a very enjoyable thing, and it's just so insane that it ended up ruining so many people's lives. Dancing too much killed people. And there were so many different recorded injuries and physical health problems and complications that came out of the dance marathons. In fact, it's actually been estimated that the marathon dancing had the same effect on people's bodies as walking 40 miles a day every day. Imagine weeks and months of that kind of physical strain on your body. The effects on people's bodies were severe. Contestants could barely move their joints from stiffness. Their feet would be bloodied and bruised and swollen so bad that sometimes they couldn't even fit in their dancing shoes. And their dancing shoes probably didn't even exist anymore. Everyone was wearing their shoes down through the soles. Contestants would even faint and collapse frequently just in the middle of the dance floor, not because they were falling asleep, but because they were so exhausted, they would literally just pass out. It wasn't uncommon to see people vomiting in the corner of the dance floor from all the physical pain and the exhaustion. And something I've been hinting to a little bit throughout this video is that there was at least one recorded death because of an endurance dance marathon. It was in April 1923, so very early on in the dance marathon trajectory. This was before it all got super dystopian during the Great Depression. This was back when people were just trying to have a bit of fun. A 27-year-old man named Homer Morehouse entered one of these endurance dance competitions and died at the 87-hour mark from heart failure. 87 hours though, that's 3.5 days that Homer lasted. And I don't know if he had like previous heart issues or health issues. I don't know how sudden this heart failure was for him and his family. Perhaps Homer's case is why those regular 15-minute breaks were introduced into dance marathons, because surely something like that would inspire change. If someone is literally dropping dead in the middle of a competition, that means there needs to be more safety regulations. So maybe that's why certain safety regulations were introduced. There were a lot of cases from these competitions where dancers would literally go insane. I mean, you can imagine that this kind of thing would be really, really affecting their mental health. They're not allowed outside for prolonged periods of time. They're not seeing their family. They're not doing anything other than listening to music and being really stressed about keeping moving their feet. That's enough to drive anyone insane. Contestants would start having hallucinations, like auditory and visual. They would see creatures in the corner of their vision. They would hear different voices. One woman was actually disqualified from a competition for running straight out of the dance hall because she hallucinated that there were men surrounding her with guns. Imagine how terrifying that kind of psychosis could be, and all because she had just danced for too long. Contestants would sometimes become incredibly violent due to their lack of sleep. They would literally claw at their partner's faces and even at their own. They would break out into full-on fist fights on the dance floor, sometimes with their own partner, sometimes with other people dancing. And often there wasn't much reason for any of this fighting. People were just so worn down, so on edge. They were delirious and tensions were so high. But one of the most heartbreaking stories we looked into was that of a 22-year-old woman named Gladis. She entered a dance-a-thon in Seattle in 1928, so again, very early days. She was super desperate for money, but not in the way that everyone else was during the Great Depression. She was desperate for it for one particular reason. She was in a very difficult custody battle with her ex-husband at the time. They had a son together, and her ex-husband was very rich. He was taking her to court, and he had the money to pay for the best lawyers, the best case. He was probably going to win custody of their child if Gladys didn't find the money to get her own lawyer. She knew that she couldn't fight this custody battle on her own. She needed a lawyer, but she just couldn't afford one. And so her solution was to enter an endurance dance competition and hope to win that grand prize. $1,000 would be enough for her to be able to fight her side in court and keep custody of her child. So she enters and she's doing well for about a week or so. She's been dancing with the same guy, and she was a strong contestant. She had a lot of support from the audience. She was a fan favorite. But eventually Gladys's dance partner grew delirious from the sleep deprivation, and he had a bit of a breakdown. He slapped Gladys around the face and then jumped the railing of the dance floor and just ran out of the hall and didn't speak to anyone. That was him exiting the competition. Everyone was speechless. It was a shocker moment for the crowd. All of this just feels like reality TV, don't you think? Like live reality TV. But lucky for Gladys, she wasn't disqualified. Remember, there's that rule that solo dancers can kind of keep going on their own until another partner becomes available. And one did soon enough. All in all, Gladys danced for 19 days straight, but despite her determination, she unfortunately didn't win. She placed 5th, and she did win a consolation prize of $125, but that was nothing compared to the $1,000 that she needed to be able to fight for custody of her son. Now, not only had she lost the competition, but she had probably also lost her child. Her whole world just crashed down around her in that moment. 11 days after her disqualification from the competition, Gladys received a letter from her ex-husband, who sounds like a downright cruel and evil man. He wrote to her after hearing about her failed dance-a-thon attempt, and he told her, you know, there's easier ways to kill yourself than just dancing yourself to death. Which I think is the most evil thing I've ever heard. Potentially, that is awful. That he is insinuating that she should try another method of killing herself because she has no reason to live. I think it's especially evil when you remember the situation that he is putting her in. He is making her go through all of these court proceedings to be able to see her own son. He is trying to take the custody away from her. He's already putting her through so much distress and then writes this letter on top of that. It's like he's trying to push her over the edge. And you know what? It kind of worked. After receiving that letter and knowing that she would probably never get her baby back, Gladys turned on all of the gas in her apartment and tried to take her own life. Gladys was just 22 years old at the time, and I know that she had a baby of her own, but to me, she was just a baby. She was at the very beginning of her life. She had so much left to live through. Her story just absolutely broke my heart, but there is a happy ending. She survived. The suicide attempt didn't kill her, but it did hospitalize her. But eventually, when she woke up in hospital, her ex-husband brought their child to see her. I don't know how the rest of the custody battle went. I don't know if it was called off. I mean, that would be the ideal situation, but I wouldn't put it past that man. From the brief things I've heard about him, I don't like him. After Gladys's story broke in the news, Seattle actually ended up banning endurance dance marathons completely. They had just become something entirely different to what they were first intended to be. They were meant to be this fun, light-hearted way for people to meet up and listen to good music and make new friends. It was supposed to be enjoyable. The grand prize wasn't supposed to be any kind of motivator. It was just supposed to be a bonus. But when the depression hit and people became so desperate for any level of money, that grand prize became enough to turn people against each other. People would become sick and injured, their bones broken, people would be suicidal, and so it makes sense to shut it all down. Throughout the 1930s, endurance dance marathons started to fall off a bit. They were losing popularity, and that was for multiple different reasons. Of course, one of the reasons was that they were deemed dangerous, and they were getting banned in multiple places. They were starting to get a bad reputation, and so people weren't joining them as much. But another factor in the demise of dance-a-thons was that America just came out of the Great Depression. And throughout the 30s, as people's financial situations started to ease, they no longer felt so much desperation that they would, push their bodies to such extreme limits in dance-a-thons. People found other ways to make money, and they no longer had to dance their way to psychosis and injury or even death anymore. But even though these dangerous dance-a-thons are no longer a thing, that same kind of concept still lives on into the 21st century, just in different kind of ways. You've still got stuff like Twitch subathons, where viewers can decide how long that streamer is live for, and sometimes they are live for months. The audience can keep them there as long as they want, to a degree. A lot of Twitch streamers put a cap on their subathons so that they can't keep them there for months. But the viewers decide how long they stay live by sending them gifts and money and, I don't know what they do on Twitch, but they send them stuff and they stay live. It's still an endurance marathon of sorts, but just in a different way. They are still just mentally enduring being an entertainer for days and days and days on end. I don't know how they do it. Most streamers are very sensible about it and they're kind to themselves and they put a cap on it, but I have seen some people going a bit crazy from subathons, and I know damn well that I would. My boyfriend asked me to do a 2-hour-long Twitch stream and I have a bit of a breakdown. I don't like live stuff. Anyway, no one asked. No one asked me that. I guess the Twitch subathon thing is a bit different because the streamers tend to be pretty well off when they begin the subathon. They're not doing it to desperately provide for their families. But I guess there are some smaller streamers that are doing it to desperately grow their following. This kind of thing also makes me think of Big Brother. We've mentioned different things like that throughout, but I just find it so mad that, especially on those cot nights where they would bring the beds up, people just have such a weird thing for watching other people living their lives. Voyeurism, that's the word, Ellie. Still to this day, people will go to insane lengths just to make money. So in many ways, the dance endurance marathons go on and on and on. I feel like that was quite a mic drop ending for this episode, so thank you so much for watching. Thanks again to Magellan TV for sponsoring this video. Remember, if you click the link down below in the description of this video, there will be a special offer waiting for you. I love my Magellan TV subscription, and I know that you guys will too. If you enjoyed this video, please leave a big thumbs up or leave a comment down below. Let us know what you thought of this one. We're doing quite a few vintage things on this channel these days. I like talking about oldie-timey stuff because I don't really understand it, so it's like a history lesson for me. Leaving a comment on this video or engaging with it in some kind of way really helps to push it out on YouTube, and I know that that's not the most important thing in the world, but me and the team would be very, very grateful. We're getting really excited about the Freaky Friday series, and I know that a lot of you guys are getting excited about it as well, so sound off in the comments down below. Let us know what kind of things you want us to cover, because we're always looking for new video topics. This series is a little bit harder to find topics for because I can't just search up murders that sound interesting. I'm weird freaky situations that have happened, and Google's girl, I don't know what you're talking about. So if there's ever anything that pops into your mind that you want to see us cover on Freaky Friday, reach out somehow. I have all different social medias, by the way. I don't promote those very often, but here they are on screen. My Twitter, my Instagram, my TikTok. You can reach out to me. You can leave a comment, hey. But anyway, I've blabbed for long enough. Thank you so much for watching this video. I really appreciate it. If you want to watch another one of my videos, there's one on screen right now that you can click, or you can subscribe to my channel using the circle with my face in it. We post new content every single week. True crime, Freaky Friday, both of them. But yeah, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye!